is my home. I promise to keep it healthy and beautiful. I will love the land, the air, the water, and all living creatures. I will be a defender of my planet, united with friends.
My name is Commissioner Frank Avila, and I'm a commissioner at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. And the name of our show is Our Children's Future. And today, as my guest, I have Dr. Warren Porter. And Dr. Warren Porter is a professor and former chair of zoology at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, and also a board member of Beyond Pesticide, a nonprofit group in Washington, D.C. Beyond Pesticide works with allies in protecting public health and the environment to lead the transition to a world free of toxic pesticides. Beyond Pesticide provides the public with useful information on pesticides and alternatives to their use. With this information, people can and do protect themselves and the environment from the potential adverse public health and environment effect associated with the use and misuse of pesticides. And pesticides seeks safe air, water, land, and food for ourselves and future generation. And glad to have you on my show, Dr. Porter.
Thanks, Frank. It's great to be here.
Yeah, you know, when I first met you and mentioned that you were a doctor in zoology, I said, doctor in zoology, and here we're going to talk about humans and pesticides. And Dr. Warner, what got you started looking into pesticides' effect on children's health? And why should we be concerned about the children? You know, our introduction song is our kids are going to save the planet.
That's right. They will, if we give them a chance.
Yes.
And that's really what we're here to talk about. It all started on the 10th of February, 1997, when I picked up the newspaper, and there on the front page was this incredible story about how our school district in Madison was spending as much on reading, writing, and arithmetic as they were on remedial education. And all of a sudden, I had no idea that we were having to spend so much to deal with kids who were having problems learning and having health problems and having birth defects. And on that front page, on that particular day, was this chart, a graph that showed a huge increase in learning disabilities, in birth defects, and in behavioral disorders. And in fact, they're showing that right now. This was the chart that really began to force me to move from looking at just animals and their health effects of pesticides to actually looking at what was going on in our kids.
And I see some of the percentages. Some are like 87%. Is that in learning disabilities?
Yeah, it's huge, and this was happening over a 5-year period.
And it increased every year.
It's going up, and it's not just local to Madison. I mean, it's been going on here in Chicago for years and years. My sister is an occupational therapist who's practiced here in the public school system for 30 years, and she put me onto this maybe 20 years ago. At least she was saying, boy, the kids are starting to show all kinds of problems. And very recently she said it just got so bad and so deep here in the Chicago area that she just decided to retire. Is that such a huge load on her?
No, probably not from pesticides. Maybe living in a more urban area, as in Chicago, we had lead. And now they banned lead. You know, they cannot have lead in any of our products now. And I think that started with 1978 or 87 in one of those years.
There are many factors involved in the kinds of health challenges that our children are experiencing now. Lead is certainly one of them. Mercury is another. Pesticides in their food and water is another. Flame retardants in their furniture is another.
Yes.
Plasticizers in the plastic bottles and toys that they might put in their mouth is another. These are all things that are affecting their immune system, their nervous system, their hormones.
You know, in the Chicago newspaper, a while back. They did a study on crime versus the elimination of lead. And the graph or the study showed that as the lead was reduced here in the Chicagoland area, crime was also reduced. And probably that had something to do with learning disability or behavior of kids. Or
there have been a number of studies showing that heavy metals can really alter behavioral patterns. There's no doubt about that. Some of the pesticides out there that induce higher levels of steroids can also cause rage kinds of responses as well. It's a broad problem.
You know, so as we're talking more on pesticides and other compounds that are affecting our environment, people are saying, well, where's the data? Are there any scientific data to make sure that what we're saying, do you have any data to back this up? So are there any data that you could back this up?
There are a lot of studies, and I have a couple of examples. One, and the first one, is probably the most classic example of, if you will, a perfect, or as close as we can get to a perfect human experiment. It happened in Mexico and set up with the purchase of a valley in Mexico called the Yaqui Valley.
And that's figure 4 they were going to bring up.
That's right.
Yes.
Yes. And what was we had a situation where a charitable foundation in the United States decided to help the economy of Mexico. And so they made money available, and a group of people obtained some of that money. They bought this valley, which was populated by Native Americans of Inca descent. And they said, we'd like you to work the fields for us. And half the population said, no, thank you. And they just uprooted their families from this valley and moved them way up on the mountain. And so you had a separation of a population almost exactly in half, where cousins and other relatives were just separated. Some would be not exposed up on the mountain, and others down in the valley would have a significant exposure because they began to spray on a weekly basis. And what happened was, firstly, the mothers began to get exposure, and they began to get breast cancer in large numbers and began to die. But what caused them really to respond was the fact that their children down in the valley were different. And that illustration that we just had on there was showing that Dr. Elizabeth Gillette's did. Was a figure. Now, a normal fourfold would draw your sticker with figures and bits on the hands and the feet.
Whenever we open, Sherry, would you
there we go. Yeah, what you see is the side comes in. Children on the left-hand side of the image who were healthy, they were all the figures, and what this is very typical. Left way to see a child on the grass on the right side of the drawn from. Children were down in the valley being exposed in the time they were received in the womb through the priest. And you see two. One is the kids had very poor care for drummers. Cancer the drummers, the kids on were healthy, so that they were the kids on the were exposed started them up. Occupational therapist sister went to these figures, and I was able to that because Dr. Gillette told me how they were. Both of them indicate, and they start the bottom up. It's a case of sensory motor coordination. You have to have prodding.
So this is because the fields that they were growing the crops and the people were working and the family were living in they were seeing the spray or any drift. They were going to home in the food or water.
They were getting it everywhere.
And every day probably, because I don't know how many on a farm. I don't know how many days they use pesticides or maybe fertilizers too. Fertilizer got ingredients in them also.
Nitrate, in fact, is a very important chemical because it actually will suppress your ability to detoxify yourself. It shuts down your defensive enzymes. And the other thing is that children don't have the defensive enzymes. Only sexually mature adults have the enzymes. So it's like you take your children and you tie their hands behind their back, and then you come in and you slug them with things.
Yes.
Like these chemicals. And so they're very, very vulnerable when they're in the womb and once they're born, until they reach sexual maturity, and then they start to develop these defensive enzymes.
I see. So when they're young and exposed to this pesticide, do they ever overcome these pesticides when they grow older, or not?
I'm glad you asked that question, because what has happened recently is that Dr. Gillette and her colleagues went back to Mexico and looked at these kids who are now teenagers.
Yes.
And what they found was that the boys were developing functional breasts with memory tissue.
Because of these pesticides, they were affected by pesticides?
They were basically feminized.
Yes.
Some of these pesticides have chemicals in them like dioxins, which look to the body like estrogen. And so the boys are getting this chemical signal that says you're a woman, not a man. And they're developing breasts that, if given the right hormones, conceivably they could nurse their babies if they ever have them. Whereas the girls in this exposed group are developing breasts that have nothing but fat in them. There's no possibility that they could ever nurse their babies. So if they ever have babies, it'll be the boys that nurse the babies, not the girls.
And these are scientific data.
Absolutely. That's
And
very
this,
solid. It's been
because
published and peer-reviewed.
Because everyone asks, well, where's your scientific data? And now, getting back to this study that was just made in Mexico, every spring here in the Midwest, we like to take care of our lawns. And I live in Chicago, and we live in a house, and down my block they have lawns too, and they hire landscapers or to come, or else they'll do them themselves. And your stores are packed through a pesticides fertilizer, and people put that on their lawns. Can that type of pesticides and fertilizer that they put on the lawn, can that have an effect on humans and animals?
It certainly can, and we're going to talk about this some more in a little bit, because what I'm going to show you is that some of the very, very most common chemicals put on our lawn are capable, well, they have contaminants in them that look like estrogens in the first place.
So that's how pesticides will get into us?
Yeah, you can breathe them, you can contact them, you lay down, it goes right through your skin, and we'll talk about why that happens.
Oh, well, let me have Sherry bring up that slide.
Okay.
Sherry, that's go on, Warren.
Okay, but before we there's the slide that was going to come next was a slide showing another piece of scientific data that we have about learning disabilities in the United States.
Okay.
And this is work done by Dr. Paul Winchester.
Okay, Sherry, would you like to bring that up? Because right now we're in the here's your slide. Okay.
Yeah. Now, what Dr. Winchester decided to do is, firstly, I should introduce him in a way. He's a head of a neonatology infant care unit in Indiana. He's a very respected medical doctor, and he began to become interested in the relationship between a very common herbicide, atrazine, and also nitrate, and how that was affecting children in Indiana and across the United States. And the graph we have here, the solid image that you see on the bottom there that has that sharp mountain-like peak on it, that indicates as we go from one month to the next through the year, from January all the way to December, how the concentration of atrazine changes, and it peaks, goes to a very high value in June.
And why is that? Why in June?
This is because this is a time when people are, when farmers are and urban landowners are putting herbicides on their crops, on their lawns, and the rains come, it washes it off, and it shows up in the surface waters and in groundwater. And then in many cases this water becomes a source of drinking water or of other exposure. But what's interesting here is there's a line that also comes across that graph, and it's a measure of the learning abilities of children in high school, where you're looking at their scores going from left to right. You see how the scores start going down and down and down, and they bottom out near where the peak of the pesticides are, and then the line goes back up again. And what that's showing us is that the month that the child was conceived is a very crucial time in the life of an infant. And when they are conceived, when the chemical concentrations are highest, the indications from these data are that they will not do as well. There will be problems with their learning abilities because of exposures to them, probably through their mother, who was drinking water or having other kinds of chemical contamination.
Now, that's interesting. And I've been to a lot of conferences, and they talk about the level of the chemicals or the compounds that are coming into our environment. is so small that they said it won't have an effect on the human being. Now you know, and this is what they all say. Now, at what level can it have an effect, like you mentioned, atrazine? At what level can that have an effect, or is it so small that it will never have an effect?
There have been a number of studies with atrazine. Some of the most carefully done are those by Tyrone Hayes at Berkeley. And he's shown that incredibly small, 1 to 5 parts per billion, is capable of altering sexual development in frogs, changing the voice. Basically, atrazine feminizes animals. In all the major classes of vertebrates, amphibians, reptiles,
you know,
birds,
I have a
animals.
slide on that, but we're going to talk more about that. But
yeah.
But let's get to, okay. So we get the, and that's how the. So how do pesticides get inside of? Have we fully explained that?
No, we haven't really. Maybe that's what we ought to do next. Is let's go and take a look at how do pesticides work, how are they designed, why do they kill?
Yes.
So if we could have that next image. What we have here is a drawing that, and we'll focus on the bottom half of this drawing first. That's a cross-section through a leaf, and the top of the leaf is a waxy top part. And what you do if you want to get in through the surface of the leaf to kill the plant is you got to have something that dissolves in fat, because the waxy surface on leaves is a barrier to entry. But if you have, you know, fats dissolve in fats, and so we've got, if you add solvents, special kinds of solvents that don't have any electrostatic charges with them, that will dissolve in that fat. So that's one way of getting your pesticide into the organism. The other way to get it in is through the breathing pore, which is in the bottom of that leaf there. This is a special channel that allows air to flow through it. And on the inside of that channel is sort of a hemisphere, a half bubble of water, a film of water, which has surface tension, like a soap bubble that you blow. And by adding something called surfactants, which are sort of soaps, it weakens that surface tension and allows for much more rapid penetration through the barrier. And so you get in either through the skin by adding oily solvents, or through the breathing pores by adding surfactants. So that gets it into the body. And the trouble, you see, is that this is a plant leaf you're initially designing it for, but our skin is a waxy surface, just like the surface of a leaf. And our lung surface is a breathing surface, just like the breathing surface on a plant. And so we can get pesticides coming through our skin if we happen to contact...
Through our pores of our skins.
Actually, right through the skin. You don't even need the pores. It goes right through the waxy surface.
Oh.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't believe it, next time you take a shower, watch how that water beads up on your skin.
Yeah.
Just like a nice shiny car.
Yeah.
We are a fat surface here.
Yeah. And so when I mentioned my question a while back about our homes, we're going to take care of our lawns, we're going to kill the weeds, we're going to get pesticides on that and really kill that weed and really spread it all over. But then if we have a dog, our dog will walk on it. If we have kids that don't wear shoes, go on the grass, or maybe they'll lay on the grass, and they'll bring it into the house also.
That's right.
And they were saying that what we bring into the house is so minute to compare to the dust that's in our house that is 10 or 15 times more greater. So if we live in a house that's all dusty, then and we don't get sick, so then that small amount of pesticide won't hurt us.
Actually,
you ever heard that story?
I've heard that story a lot, but what's interesting is the actual data contradict that right down the line. If you're wearing shoes, for example, the bottoms of your shoes are going to have waxy material on them.
Yeah.
Well, for one reason or another, and you come into the house, well, firstly, when you step on the lawn, that waxy material mixes with the waxy surface of the leaves, which has pesticides on it, and the fat-soluble stuff dissolves in the bottom of your shoes. Then you walk into the house, and you'll either have carpeting, which is, again, a sort of a waxy substrate, and so it'll go right from your shoes onto the carpet. Or if you have polished wooden floors, it'll go into the waxier floors. And what they've shown is that when you keep coming in like this, you bring more every time you come in, and the concentration of pesticide in your house on the floor can often be way above what you have on your lawn. And so your inside of your house becomes more toxic than the lawn even that's been sprayed, especially over time.
Sure.
This is one of the reasons why we always take our shoes off when we come in the front door and walk around in our stocking feet. You protect the house.
Are there any abortion or fetal loss effect of common pesticides to a person, a human being? Any?
We got into looking at lawn chemicals because.
Now, when you say we, who's we?
I'm sorry, myself and my graduate student, Fernanda Caviedes, and one of my research technicians, Dr. Jim Jaeger.
Okay.
And so we said, hey, we wondered, can these lawn chemicals, could they induce abortion? So we went to a local farm and fleet store and bought one of these pesticide mixtures, took it to the lab, diluted it down into a series of much reduced concentrations, and then added it to the drinking water of mice. And I think the next slide illustrates the 3 different chemicals that were in this particular lawn mix, which was one of the most common ones. If we could have that next image, we can take a look at that because, yeah, there was one thing we missed an image here because there was a shoot.
It's okay.
There we go. That's the one I want.
That's the molecule.
Because we need to understand, once you get this pesticide inside an organism, how does it actually kill?
Yes.
Now, we've talked about how it gets in, but now the question is, how do you kill the organism? Now, when you design a pesticide, you in the top part of that image there's a ring-shaped structure which has 3 ends in it for nitrogen.
Yes.
That ring-shaped structure is a part of the pesticide molecule that is fat-soluble. Fat dissolves in fat. And then what you do is you hang off of that ring some electrostatic charge group. In this case, there's a nitrogen and 2 hydrogens, which gives it a positive charge. So you've got a fat-soluble part on the bottom and a water-soluble part on the top, because when you have an electrostatic charge, that dissolves in water. So you've got sort of a 2-part molecule. And the reason you wanted to design it that way is the bottom half of that figure shows a cross-section through a cell. There's a circle there. And the cell surface is a fat surface. It's made up of phospholipids. That's our cell membrane. And so if you have a part of the molecule that's fat-soluble, that's essentially a master entry key that lets you get into every cell of the body. The brain cells, the testicles, the ovaries, everything. And so that fat-soluble part lets you dissolve in the membrane and get you inside the cell. Now, once you're inside the cell, then what takes over is the electrostatic charge. Now, there's a basic principle here. Opposite charges attract. And so, in this case, we have a positively charged molecule. That'll be attracted to anything that's negatively charged, which is the opposite charge. Now, you might be targeting the powerhouse of the cell, what's called the mitochondrion there. That's where these very high-energy electrons, which have a negative charge, are running around. And you get in there and you stop that flow of electrons. It's sort of like pulling the master switch on a light or your power supply for your house. You shut it off, the cell dies. The only trouble is that it's not just the mitochondrion that has negative charges on it. Your genetic material, the DNA, which is the coding for the operations of the cell, the blueprint for operations, that's also negatively charged. And so that flat dinner plate shaped molecule can slide in between the rungs of the genetic material, the DNA, and lodge there. And then when that DNA unzips to copy itself, it comes to that molecule and it breaks. We call that a mutation. And that's how you can get cancer started, or a bunch of other things that could bugger up the cell's operations in the future. There are many other parts of the cell that are also electrostatically charged. So you basically have here a molecular bull in a china shop. It could do all kinds of things, just depending on where it happens to enter and what it
in our body
first. That's right.
You know, I was reading something that the EPA wants to do. They want to start a 3rd label on pesticide products. And I think after hearing everything about what we're just talking in this short little talk about pesticides, is that everyone should be careful on the use of pesticides. And what's the short, you know, the EPA labels all our pesticide products. Is that correct? What's the shortcoming in them?
Oh, there are there are 6 major shortcomings in the way the EPA operates in terms of its registration process, and we'll come to a slide outlining that a little bit later. But basically, what
okay. Let's. We have only a couple more minutes. Would you like to talk about Tyrone Slide or on the EPA or?
Let's see. I think maybe what we ought to do is just deal with EPA registration process in general.
Okay.
What happens is that the EPA registers the ultra-pure reagent-grade material.
And that's a dream figure, Sherry. Go on.
Yeah, but what you buy off the shelf is something very different.
Yeah.
What you buy off the shelf is the mixture of the reagent, the active ingredient, plus those solvents we talked about, plus those surfactants. And several studies have shown that when you have that kind of a mixture, it's much more reactive than the so-called reagent grade thing. Also, it's more fat soluble, it's more water soluble. And so those kinds of additions allow you to get through and
that's on the screen right now we have.
That's right. These are the dreams for public awareness, the things that, the shortcomings in the EPA registration process that make this whole business of registration one that's very inappropriate for giving the public a realistic awareness of the hazards that these chemicals actually represent.
And now there's a talk now of want to put what they call a third label. Like if they put the pesticide, or they put a label on it, people might think it's safe to buy because it has a third label on it that showing, like the Red Cross. Some of the people are using the Red Cross label on their product. And right now there's a lobbyist group against allowing third party on pesticides.
Absolutely. People need to understand that every single pesticide